"If you wake my son, I'll give you all 9 hotels." The words echoed through the presidential suite of one of America's most prestigious hospitals. They were not spoken in faith. They were spoken in desperation and arrogance. Richard Al Mahmoud had built an empire worth billions. 9 luxury hotels across the United States. He had bought silence, loyalty, and influence. But now, standing beside the motionless body of his 8-year-old son, he was about to learn a truth no amount of money could escape. Wealth can buy power. It cannot buy life. And it cannot command God. What Richard didn't know was that the barefoot man, standing quietly near the door, was not there by accident. Before the story continues, let me ask you something. What time is it where you're listening right now? And what city or country are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. Whether it's early morning, late at night, or somewhere in between, you're here for a reason. And if stories of faith, redemption, and unseen miracles speak to your heart, make sure you're subscribed to Heaven Walks with Us. You're not here by chance. The monitors in the room blinked with cold, mechanical precision. Each soft beep felt louder than the last. The suite cost $15,000 a night. Italian leather furniture, private staff, soundproof walls, and a view overlooking the city skyline. Yet none of it mattered. Richard Al Mahmoud stood beside the hospital bed, staring at his son. Adam was 8 years old. He had been in a coma for 6 months. His chest rose and fell only because a machine allowed it to. His small hand lay limp against the white sheets, unmoving, unresponsive, as if the boy Richard, once carried on his shoulders, had already slipped somewhere beyond reach. Richard was not a man accustomed to helplessness. At 52, he was one of the most powerful hotel magnates in America. His properties stretched from Miami to New York, from Los Angeles to Chicago, from Las Vegas to Aspen. Presidents stayed in his hotels. Celebrities hosted secret weddings in his penthouses. Deals worth hundreds of millions were signed over glasses of imported whiskey in rooms bearing his name. Money had always obeyed him. Doctors usually did too, but not this time. In 6 months, Richard had flown in specialists from Boston, Berlin, Tokyo, and Tel Aviv. He had paid for experimental treatments, private scans, exclusive consultations, costs that would bankrupt ordinary families in a lifetime. Nothing worked. Every report sounded the same. Declining brain activity, no meaningful response, no medical explanation, and no hope. Richard clenched his jaw as the words replayed in his mind. He had crushed competitors, outbid billionaires, forced governments to bend zoning laws for his developments. Yet here, in this room, his power ended. He reached out and gently touched Adam's fingers. They were warm, but they did not squeeze back. For the first time in decades, fear crept into Richard Al Mahmoud's heart. Not the fear of loss in the market, not the fear of scandal or reputation. This was the fear of a father realizing that everything he had built, every tower of glass and marble, meant nothing if he lost the one life that mattered most. And somewhere behind him, unnoticed, a quiet presence waited. The door opened quietly. Dr. Jonathan Keller stepped into the suite, his white coat pressed, his movements precise, but his face betrayed him. In 42 years of practice, he had learned how to deliver devastating news without words. Richard Al Mahmoud didn't sit down. He never sat down for bad news. He stood with his arms crossed, staring at the monitors behind the doctor as if daring the machines to contradict what was coming. "Mr. Al Mahmoud," Dr. Keller began carefully, "we've reviewed the latest scans." Richard said nothing. "The cerebral activity has continued to decline," the doctor went on. "The responses we were monitoring, they're no longer present." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. "You said that yesterday." Dr. Keller nodded. "And the day before. But now we're seeing something more concerning." He hesitated, choosing each word like a man walking through glass. "In my professional opinion, and I don't say this lightly, your son is approaching a state consistent with irreversible brain damage." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Richard's jaw tightened. "How much longer?" he asked. Dr. Keller swallowed. "Hours, perhaps days." Silence swallowed the room. "You're telling me," Richard said slowly, "that after 6 months, after 37 specialists, after more money than most hospitals see in a year, you have nothing." Dr. Keller straightened. "We've done everything modern medicine allows: experimental protocols, neurological stimulation, advanced imaging. There is no intervention left that science can offer." Science. The word struck Richard like an insult. He took a step forward. "Do you know how much I've paid to hear that word?" he said quietly. "Do you know how many conferences I funded? How many departments I upgraded?" "Doctor." Keller met his gaze. "Yes, sir. And none of it has changed the outcome." Something snapped. Richard reached for the crystal vase on the side table and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall in a burst of glass and silence. "Useless!" he roared. "All of you, the best minds in the world, and you surrender." The nurses froze. Dr. Keller did not raise his voice. "Mr. Al-Mahmoud," he said, his tone steady but weary, "medicine has limits. This is one of them." Richard laughed a harsh, hollow sound. "Limits?" he said. "I don't accept limits." Dr. Keller lowered his eyes. "Your son's body is alive, but his mind is slipping away." He paused, then added softly, "You may want to consider preparing yourself." Preparing yourself. For what? For goodbye. Richard turned away, his shoulders rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. As Dr. Keller quietly exited the suite, the machines continued their indifferent rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. And for the first time in his life, Richard Al-Mahmoud faced an enemy that neither money nor medicine could defeat. After Dr. Keller left, the room felt emptier than before. Not quieter. Emptier. The machines continued their relentless rhythm, but Richard Al-Mahmoud no longer listened to them. He had heard enough science. Over the next several days, Richard did what he had always done when faced with failure. He searched for another door. If medicine had reached its limit, then perhaps something older, something unseen, still remained. He summoned people he had once mocked in private. A well-known faith healer from Texas arrived first, escorted by security and carrying a leather-bound Bible thick with notes. He laid hands on Adam and whispered prayers with practiced confidence. When nothing happened, he blamed spiritual resistance and requested a donation to continue the work. Richard wrote the check without comment. Next came a rabbi from Jerusalem, a man revered for his knowledge of ancient prayers. He recited psalms in Hebrew, his voice trembling with sincerity. Richard watched Adam's chest rise and fall, searching for movement that never came. Then an imam from Cairo, a Sufi mystic, a Buddhist monk, flown in from Nepal, each with their own language, their own rituals, their own promises wrapped carefully in uncertainty. Candles burned. Incense filled the air. Hands were raised. Chants echoed softly against marble walls. Nothing changed. The boy did not stir. Richard began to feel something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Not anger, not pride. Fear. The kind of fear that strips a man of his titles and leaves only his humanity behind. Late one night, after everyone had left, Richard sat alone beside the bed. The city lights glimmered through the window like distant stars. Indifferent, unreachable, he stared at his son's face, pale and still. "I would give anything," he whispered. "Everything." His voice cracked. "I built all of this," he said, gesturing to the room, the machines, the view, "and none of it can reach you." For the first time in his life, Richard prayed without an audience. Not the polished prayers of ceremony, not the cautious prayers of tradition. This was raw, unfiltered, desperate. "God," he said quietly, unsure even who he was speaking to, "if you exist, if you've ever listened to anyone, listen now." His hands trembled. "I don't care about the hotels. I don't care about the money. Take it. Take all of it. Just don't take my son." He bowed his head. There was no answer, no voice, no sign, Only the steady beep of machines and the unbearable weight of silence. And then a soft knock came at the door. Richard lifted his head slowly. Another visitor. Another stranger. Another so-called solution. He wiped his face and prepared himself to hear one more lie. He did not know that this time the door was opening for a reason. The knock came again. Soft, unassuming, almost hesitant. Richard Al-Mahmoud didn't answer at first. He was tired of interruptions, tired of hope dressed up as expertise. The door opened slightly, and a nurse stepped in. "Mr. Al-Mahmoud," she said gently, "there's someone asking to see you." Richard didn't turn around. "If they're asking for money, tell them to leave." The nurse hesitated. "He hasn't asked for anything." That made Richard look up. "He says he believes he can help your son." Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Of course he does. He doesn't look like a doctor," the nurse added carefully. "Or anyone important." Something in her tone made Richard pause. "Send him in," he said flatly. "Let's get this over with." The door opened wider. The man who entered did not belong in that room. He wore a simple, worn white tunic, faded from countless washings, loose linen pants, sandals so old the leather had softened and split, revealing dusty toes. No briefcase, no badge, no entourage. He moved slowly, quietly, as if the air itself were sacred. The room seemed to change when he stepped inside. Not brighter, not darker, deeper. Richard studied him from head to toe, irritation rising in his chest. "This is the one?" Richard asked the nurse, his voice sharp. She nodded and quickly retreated, closing the door behind her. Silence filled the room again. Richard gestured toward the bed without looking at the man. "That's my son." The stranger said nothing. Richard turned, his eyes hard. "You're here to heal him?" The man met his gaze calmly. "I'm here because you asked for help," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. Richard scoffed. "I asked God for help, not—" he gestured vaguely. "This." The man didn't flinch. "The best doctors in the world have failed," Richard continued, his voice rising. "I've spent more money in 6 months than most people earn in 10 lifetimes." He stepped closer, towering over the stranger. "And now you walk in here barefoot, dressed like a beggar, and tell me you can help my son?" "I'm not a doctor," the man said simply. Richard laughed, a cruel, exhausted sound. "Of course you're not. Then what are you? A prophet? A holy man? Another miracle worker looking for a headline?" The stranger held his gaze, unshaken. "I didn't come for your money," he said, "and I didn't come for your approval." Something about the way he said it, without pride, without fear, made Richard uneasy. The room fell silent again. The machines continued their steady rhythm, and for reasons Richard could not explain, standing before this poor, unremarkable stranger, he felt something he had not felt with doctors, mystics, or money. A pressure, as if the truth itself had just walked in and was waiting to speak. Richard Al-Mahmoud took a slow step forward. Up close, the stranger looked even more out of place. His clothes worn, his hands rough, his face marked by time and quiet endurance. He carried no tools, no confidence, built on credentials. Richard could smell whiskey on his own breath. "You really think you can help him?" Richard said, his voice low, edged with disbelief. The man did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at Adam. Not at the machines, not at the monitors, at the boy. That alone irritated Richard. "Everyone who comes in here looks at the screens first," Richard snapped. "They look at numbers, data, charts." The stranger said calmly, "I see a child." Something dark twisted inside Richard's chest. He let out a harsh laugh. "A child?" he repeated. "Do you know how many experts have stood where you're standing?" He began pacing the room. Neurosurgeons, specialists, professors with awards hanging on their walls, 12 of the best minds on this planet. He stopped abruptly and turned back. They all said the same thing. His voice dropped. "Brain death." The stranger remained still. "So here's what we're going to do," Richard said, his lips curling into a bitter smile. He stepped closer until they were face to face. "I'm tired of false hope. I'm tired of lies dressed as faith." His eyes burned with exhaustion and rage. "If you can heal my son," he said slowly, deliberately, "I'll give you everything." The man raised his eyes. "All 9 hotels," Richard continued. "Miami, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Las Vegas, Aspen, San Francisco, Boston, Washington." He laughed again, sharper this time. "An empire worth billions." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Sign the papers. Hand over the keys. Every last one." Then his smile faded. "But you won't," he added coldly. "Because it's impossible." Richard leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. 12 doctors declared him beyond recovery. The scans confirm it. There's no activity, no response, no hope. He straightened and gestured toward the door. "So, go ahead," he said mockingly. "Pray, chant, wave your hands, perform your miracle." The stranger's expression did not change. Richard crossed his arms. "And when you fail like everyone else," he continued, "you walk out that door and never come back." The room felt heavy, suffocating. The machines beeped steadily, indifferent to the challenge being issued. For a long moment, the stranger said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked a single question. "May I see the child?" Richard stared at him, stunned by the simplicity of the request. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped his throat. "Of course," he said, stepping aside with theatrical contempt. "Go ahead, show me your miracle." He extended his arm toward the adjoining room, and as the stranger turned to walk past him, Richard did not realize that he had just made a promise, that heaven was about to take very seriously. The stranger took a step toward the adjoining room, then he stopped. He did not turn around. Without raising his voice, he spoke, and the sound of it filled the suite in a way Richard had never experienced before. "The first hotel you ever bought," the man said calmly, "was not in Miami. It was in Detroit." Richard froze. "You purchased it 27 years ago," the stranger continued, "for $3.2 million. Richard's stomach tightened. "You were 25 years old, working at your father's construction company, desperate to prove you were smarter than him." The air felt suddenly thin. How Richard began, but the man did not stop. "The money was not yours," the stranger said. "It came from a pension fund." Richard's heart slammed against his chest. "A fund built by 40 men," the stranger went on. "Laborers who spent their lives pouring concrete, lifting steel, trusting that their final years would be protected." Richard turned slowly. "That's impossible," he said, his voice tight. "No one knows that." The stranger finally faced him. "You told yourself it was a loan," he said, "that you would return it once the hotel became profitable." Richard felt his legs weaken. "But you never did." The room seemed to tilt. The stranger's eyes were no longer merely calm. They carried something heavier. "3 of those men died in absolute poverty," he continued. Harold Whitman, 74 years old, collapsed from hunger 2 blocks from a soup kitchen. Richard staggered backward. Samuel Ortiz, 68, died of heart failure after he could not afford his medication. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "And David Keller," the stranger said softly, 71, took his own life after losing his home. Richard's knees buckled. He grabbed the back of the leather sofa to keep from falling. "Stop," he whispered. "Stop." The stranger did not raise his voice. "You burned their letters," he said. Richard shook his head violently. "No, no. You read the first few lines," the stranger continued, "then threw them into the fireplace. Wives, children, grandchildren, begging, explaining, pleading." Richard slid down onto the floor. "I couldn't face it," he choked. "I couldn't undo it without destroying everything." "And so you buried it," the stranger said. "Under marble floors, under gold fixtures, under luxury and applause." Richard covered his ears. "Enough," he sobbed. "Please, enough." But the stranger knelt down, bringing himself level with Richard's face. "You've lived 27 years without consequences," he said quietly. "Building towers the world admired." He paused. And now your son lies powerless, and you finally understand how those families felt." Richard's entire body trembled. "I didn't know they would die," he whispered. "I didn't want this." The stranger's voice softened, but did not excuse. "You didn't want to know," he said. "There is a difference." Richard pressed his forehead to the floor. "My son is innocent," he cried. "He has nothing to do with my sins." "Neither did their children," the stranger replied gently. Silence fell like a weight. Then the stranger stood. "I'm going to enter the room now," he said. "I'm going to touch your son." Richard looked up, eyes red and hollow. "And then," the stranger continued, "you will understand that there are things all the money in the world cannot buy." He turned toward the door. "But faith, even faith the size of a mustard seed, can move what you believed was impossible." The door closed behind him, and Richard al-Mahmoud remained on the floor, sweat cold on his skin, his empire collapsing, not from loss of money, but from the weight of truth. Richard remained on the floor long after the door closed. He did not hear the machines anymore. He did not see the room. All he could see were faces. Men with cracked hands and tired eyes. Men who had trusted him. Men whose futures he had stolen, one signature at a time. For 27 years he had buried them. Now they stood before him, not in anger, but in silence. A silence heavier than accusation. His chest tightened as memories surged back with brutal clarity. The office in Detroit. The pension account ledger glowing on his computer screen. The rationalization whispered to himself in the early hours of the morning. "Just a loan. I'll return it. No one will ever know." But he had known. He had always known. Richard curled inward, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor. "I thought I was building something," he whispered. "I thought I was escaping poverty, escaping weakness." His voice broke. "I didn't know I was becoming this." He saw again the letters, the handwriting uneven, desperate. The envelopes stacked on his desk. He remembered how his hand trembled the first time he threw one into the fire. The second time had been easier. By the 10th, he didn't even read them anymore. Ashes fell into the grate, glowing briefly before disappearing, just like the people who had written them. A sound rose from his chest, a raw, broken sob that tore through years of control. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the empty room. "I'm so sorry." But no one answered. From the adjoining room, a voice began to speak, not loudly, not urgently. It was slow, deliberate, ancient. Richard lifted his head. The words were unlike anything he had ever heard. They were not Arabic, not Hebrew, not Latin. They carried weight. Each syllable seemed to settle into the room itself, pressing against the walls, the floor, the air. Richard pushed himself up unsteadily and moved toward the door. When he opened it, the sight before him stole his breath. The stranger stood beside Adam's bed, hands extended over the boy's forehead. His eyes were closed. The monitors continued their indifferent rhythm. Nothing visible had changed, and yet everything felt different. Richard stepped inside quietly, as if afraid to break something sacred. "What are you doing?" he whispered. The stranger did not open his eyes. "I'm speaking with my father," he said. Richard swallowed hard. "Your father?" he asked, confused. "Where is he?" The stranger's voice carried a sorrowful gentleness. "He is everywhere," he replied. "He is in this room. He is in the streets where the forgotten died. He is in every place where suffering cries out for redemption." Richard's knees weakened. He leaned against the doorframe to keep from falling. "I don't understand," he said. "How do you know their names? Their stories?" The stranger opened his eyes, and when he looked at Richard, there was no hatred there, only truth. "You buried them," he said, "but my father gathered them." Richard's breath caught. He counted every tear their wives cried, the stranger continued. He heard every prayer spoken by hungry children. He was there when David Keller wrote his final letter, wondering how the boy he once carried on his shoulders could betray him so completely. Richard covered his face with his hands. "I lived a lie," he said through tears. "I lived well, while others suffered because of me." "Yes," the stranger replied quietly. "And now you see." Richard looked up. His face broken open. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Tell me what to do." The stranger stepped closer. "Not fear," he said. "Not bargains." He placed a hand over Richard's trembling heart. "I want your awakening." And in that moment, before any miracle touched the body of his son, Richard al-Mahmoud finally woke up. The room seemed to shrink, not in size, but in distance. As if heaven and earth had drawn closer than Richard believed possible, the stranger returned his attention fully to the child. He placed both hands gently on Adam's forehead. His touch was neither dramatic nor forceful. There were no gestures meant for an audience, no raised voice. He simply closed his eyes. Then he began to speak. The sound that filled the room did not resemble any language Richard knew. The syllables were slow, measured, each one carrying a gravity that made the air itself feel heavier. They did not echo. They settled. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Richard watched, frozen between hope and terror. Nothing happened. No sudden movement. No gasp. No miracle yet. Minutes passed. Richard's mind screamed for something, anything to change. Instead, memories returned, uninvited. The letters, the fire, the faces of men whose names he had tried to forget. His chest tightened as understanding pressed in from every side. This prayer was not about his son, not yet. The stranger spoke again, the words flowing deeper now, more intense, as if reaching beyond the room, beyond time itself. Richard felt something break, not his spirit, but the armor he had worn for decades. He collapsed to his knees. For the first time since Adam fell from that balcony, Richard al-Mahmoud prayed without conditions, without leverage, without bargaining. "God," he whispered, his voice shaking, "if you are listening, I don't ask this because I deserve it." Tears streamed down his face. "I deserve judgment. I deserve nothing." He pressed his forehead to the floor. "But my son is innocent," he said. "He didn't steal. He didn't destroy lives." His voice cracked completely. "If mercy exists, if grace is real, show it to him." The prayer from the stranger deepened, the cadence shifting, no longer gentle, but commanding, as if calling something lost back home. Richard felt the weight of it in his bones. He did not dare look at the monitors. He did not dare breathe. The machines continued their indifferent rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a subtle sound, so faint Richard thought he imagined it. A soft rustle against fabric. His head snapped up. Adam's right hand, motionless for 6 months, twitched. Richard's breath caught painfully in his throat. "No," he whispered. "No, this can't be happening." The stranger continued praying, his words now rising and falling like waves. Adam's fingers moved again, once, twice. Then the smallest finger curled inward. Richard scrambled to his feet, heart pounding violently. "Adam," he whispered. The monitor changed pitch. Numbers began to climb. The stranger did not stop. His voice grew stronger, sharper, as if pulling something back from a great distance. Adam's eyelids trembled. Richard staggered forward, unable to process what he was seeing. The boy's eyes opened, slowly, confused, alive. "Dad," Adam whispered hoarsely. The words shattered Richard completely. He fell against the bed, sobbing uncontrollably, gripping his son's hand as if afraid the moment would disappear. Behind him, the stranger finally fell silent. And, in the space where his prayer ended, the impossible had begun. The door burst open. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Dr. Keller rushed in first, followed by nurses and 2 residents, all alerted by the sudden change in the monitors. The once steady rhythm had shifted faster, stronger, unmistakably alive. "What's happening?" Dr. Keller demanded. Then he saw Adam. The boy's eyes were open, not glazed, not unfocused. Open. For a moment, no one moved. This isn't possible," Dr. Keller whispered. Adam turned his head slightly, confusion flickering across his face as if waking from a long, peaceful sleep. "Dad," he said again, his voice weak but real. Richard clutched his son's hand, unable to speak. His entire body trembled as years of control collapsed into tears. "Call neurology," Dr. Keller snapped, snapping back into motion. "Now, I want a full neurological assessment immediately." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Machines were adjusted. Vitals were checked. Orders were given. Yet amid the movement, one thing remained unchanged. The stranger stood quietly in the corner, watching. Adam squeezed his father's fingers. "Am I home?" he asked softly. "No," Richard managed through tears. "But you will be." Within minutes, Adam was wheeled out for emergency imaging. Richard followed, refusing to let go until the last possible second. The stranger remained behind. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. Richard paced the hallway like a caged animal, his mind oscillating wildly between hope and terror. Every doctor who passed avoided eye contact, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Dr. Keller emerged holding a tablet. His face had lost all color. "Mr. Al-Mahmoud," he said slowly, "I need you to understand what I'm about to say." Richard's heart slammed. The scans from earlier today showed near total loss of cortical activity, the doctor continued. No meaningful brain function, minimal brainstem response. Richard nodded numbly. "But these new scans," Dr. Keller said, his voice shaking, "show something else entirely." He turned the screen toward Richard. "Normal activity," he said. "Every region, fully restored, as if the injury never existed." Richard stared at the images, his vision blurring. "That can't happen," one of the neurologists said quietly behind him. "Brain tissue doesn't regenerate like this." Dr. Keller swallowed hard. "In 42 years," he said, "I have never seen anything remotely like this." Richard's knees nearly gave out. "What does that mean?" he asked. Dr. Keller hesitated, then answered honestly. "It means this recovery has no medical explanation." Richard turned slowly. The stranger stood near the window, hands folded, eyes calm. "Impossible for men," the stranger said gently, "but not for God." The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. None argued. None could. That night, Adam returned to the room, awake, alert, asking for water, asking for food. As Richard sat beside the bed, overwhelmed beyond words, Adam looked around the room. Then his gaze settled on the stranger. "He was with me," Adam said softly. Richard's breath caught. "What do you mean, son?" he asked. "When everything was dark," Adam continued, "I wasn't alone." The stranger said nothing. Richard felt a chill run through him, not of fear, but of awe. The miracle had happened. But something deep inside Richard told him the story was far from over. Because this miracle had not come to celebrate him. It had come to change him. The room grew quiet again. Not the tense silence of fear, but the fragile stillness that follows a storm. Adam lay propped against the pillows, sipping water slowly, his movements cautious, as if his body were remembering how to be alive. His color had returned. His eyes were clear. Too clear. Richard sat beside him, unable to let go of his hand. Every few seconds, he checked his son's chest, as if the miracle might reverse itself if he looked away. "Dad?" Adam said softly. "Yes," Richard replied immediately. "I'm here." Adam hesitated, then looked around the room. His gaze stopped at the stranger standing near the window. "He was there," Adam said. Richard's heart skipped. "There? Where?" he asked carefully. "When I was asleep," Adam replied. "When everything was dark." The words sent a chill through the room. Richard swallowed. "What do you remember, son?" Adam stared at the ceiling for a moment, searching for words an 8-year-old was never meant to use. "It wasn't like sleeping," he said slowly. "It was like falling, but I wasn't scared." Richard leaned closer. "Because he held my hand," Adam continued. Richard's breath caught painfully in his chest. "He told me not to be afraid," Adam said, glancing again toward the stranger. "He said I wasn't alone." Richard turned sharply. The stranger met his eyes calm, knowing, but said nothing. "What else did you see?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. Adam frowned slightly, as if remembering something difficult. "He showed me things," he said. "What things?" Adam's fingers tightened around his father's. Men, he whispered. Old men, they were crying. Richard's stomach dropped. They were tired, Adam continued. They were hungry. They were looking for something they never got. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He showed me letters, Adam said next. Lots of letters. Richard's body went rigid. They were burning, Adam added softly. In a fireplace. The room seemed to tilt. Richard stared at his son, unable to speak. Adam turned his head fully toward him now. I saw you, he said gently. You were younger. You were throwing the letters away. Richard's grip loosened. No, he whispered. No, Adam? The stranger stepped forward. I didn't show him anything that wasn't true, he said quietly. Richard shot to his feet. What did you do to my son? He demanded, fear and awe colliding in his voice. The stranger's eyes were steady. Children see without the filters adults build, he said. They see truth before it's buried under fear and justification. Adam tugged on his father's sleeve. Dad, he said softly, he told me you're not bad. Richard looked down at his son, tears blurring his vision. He said you were lost, Adam continued, and that now you're found. Richard collapsed back into the chair, shaking. What else did he tell you? He asked. Adam smiled faintly. He told me I could come back, he said, but only after you learned something important. Richard's voice cracked. What did I need to learn? Adam looked at him with a wisdom that did not belong to a child. That money can't fix everything, he said, but love can. The stranger placed a hand gently on Adam's shoulder, and in that moment, Richard understood. The miracle was not just that his son had returned from the darkness. It was that the darkness itself had spoken, and told the truth he could no longer ignore. Richard stood frozen. The room felt suddenly too small to contain what was happening. Adam's words still echoed in the air. You were lost, and now you're found. Richard turned slowly toward the stranger. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely holding together. How do you know things no one else knows? How did my son see what I buried 27 years ago? The stranger stepped closer. The overhead light fell gently across his face, revealing lines etched by sorrow, compassion, and something far older than time. I know because I was there, he said softly. Richard shook his head. That's impossible. The stranger raised his hands. Not in defense, not in display. Simply open. Richard's breath stopped. In the center of each palm were scars, old, healed, but unmistakable, perfectly round marks, as if iron had once passed through flesh and bone. Richard felt his knees weaken. No, he whispered. No, this can't be real. The stranger spoke again, his voice steady but filled with infinite tenderness. I am the one your wife prayed to, he said. Richard's heart shattered at the sound of her memory. Lena, he breathed. His wife had been gone 4 years, taken by cancer, her hands wrapped around a rosary in the final hours of her life. She begged me not to give up on you, the stranger continued. She asked me to save your soul, even if it meant breaking your pride. Tears streamed freely now down Richard's face. She never stopped believing, the stranger said. Even when you stopped. Richard collapsed to his knees. You're Jesus, he whispered, the word trembling from his lips. Jesus nodded, not with triumph, but with compassion. I heal bodies, he said, but I came tonight to heal something far more wounded. Richard bowed his head to the floor. I'm not worthy, he sobbed. I've stolen. I've destroyed lives. I've lived in lies. I know, Jesus said gently. I know every sin, every letter burned, every excuse whispered in the dark. Richard trembled. Then why are you here? Jesus knelt before him, bringing himself eye level. Because mercy is greater than judgment, he said, and because I came to seek and save what was lost. Richard looked up, broken and exposed. Why save my son? He asked. Why save me? Jesus' voice softened even more. No one deserves grace, he said. That is why it is called grace. He placed a hand over Richard's heart. Your son was sick in body, Jesus continued, but you were sick in soul. And tonight, both needed healing. Richard wept openly now, not tears of fear, but tears of surrender. "What do I do?" he asked. "Tell me, and I'll do it." Jesus stood. "You already made a promise," he said. Richard remembered instantly. "If you heal my son, I'll give you all 9 hotels." His chest tightened. "I said it in anger," Richard whispered. "In cruelty. I didn't mean it." Jesus looked at him with gentle seriousness. "I take you seriously," he said, "even when you don't." Richard closed his eyes, knowing his life had already changed beyond return. The scars in Jesus' hands still glowed softly under the light. And in that quiet hospital room, a bargain made in mockery was about to become a covenant of transformation. Richard remained on his knees. The words "all 9 hotels" echoed in his mind, a promise spoken in bitterness, now standing before him like a sentence waiting to be carried out. Jesus looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I don't want your hotels," he said quietly. Richard looked up, stunned. "You don't?" he asked, almost afraid to believe it. "No," Jesus replied. "I don't need buildings made of stone and glass." Relief surged through Richard's chest, brief, intoxicating, but it vanished just as quickly. "What I want," Jesus continued, "is what you've avoided for 27 years. Jesus stepped closer. "I want restitution." The word struck harder than any accusation. "Those 40 families," Jesus said, his voice firm but calm, "they are still waiting." Richard swallowed. "You took their future," Jesus went on. "You cannot undo the past, but you can face it." Richard bowed his head. "I'll confess," he said quickly. "I'll turn myself in. I'll accept whatever punishment comes. Just tell me what to do." Jesus lifted a hand. "I don't want your confession out of fear," he said, "and I don't want obedience born of panic." Richard looked up, confused. "I want transformation born of love," Jesus said. He gestured toward the window, toward the city beyond. "Justice demands payment," Jesus said, "but mercy demands more." Richard's hands trembled. "What more?" he asked. "You must find every family," Jesus said. "Every widow, every child, every grandchild." Richard nodded. "You will return what you stole," Jesus continued, "with interest, with humility, and with your presence." Richard's heart pounded. "I'll do it," he said hoarsely. "I'll find them all." Jesus' gaze sharpened, not harsh, but unyielding. "You will not send lawyers," he said. "You will not send checks anonymously." Richard flinched. "You will go yourself," Jesus said. "You will look them in the eyes. You will listen when they curse you. You will kneel if they demand it." Richard's pride, what little remained, crumbled. "Some will never forgive you," Jesus added. "And you must accept that." Richard nodded, tears falling freely. "I deserve that," he whispered. "Yes," Jesus said gently. "But you also deserve the chance to become someone new." Richard took a shaky breath. "And the hotels?" he asked quietly. Jesus' eyes softened. "You offered them," he said, "and you will give them." Richard stiffened. "But not to me," Jesus continued. "To what they should have been from the beginning." Jesus paused. "Places of refuge," he said, "not monuments to vanity." Richard felt the weight of it settle in his chest. "You will transfer them," Jesus said, "into hands that heal rather than exploit." Richard closed his eyes. "My identity is tied to them," he admitted. "Without them, I don't know who I am." Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good," he said. "Only when false identities fall can true ones be built." Richard nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said again, this time without desperation. "I'll give them up, all of them." Jesus smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet approval. "That is the first step," he said. He turned toward Adam, sleeping peacefully now. "You asked me to save your son," Jesus said, "and I did." He looked back at Richard. "But now comes the harder miracle." Richard met his gaze. "To live changed," Jesus said. And, in that hospital room, Richard Al-Mahmoud understood. The bargain had never been about hotels. It had always been about his heart. The miracle did not end the story. It began the reckoning. 3 days after Adam awakened, Richard Al-Mahmoud made a phone call he had avoided for nearly 3 decades. He hired a private investigator in Detroit, not to protect him, not to silence anyone. To find them, Richard said quietly. All of them. The investigator hesitated. Sir, that could take time. Some records are old. Some people may have moved. Some may be dead, Richard finished. I know. There was a pause on the line. I don't care how long it takes, Richard said, or how much it costs. Find every family connected to that pension fund. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. This was no longer a spiritual moment. This was logistics. Paper trails, names, addresses, real people. At the same time, Richard made another call, this one to his legal team. I want transfer documents prepared, he said. There was immediate confusion. Which property? Sir? All of them. Silence. 9 hotels, Richard clarified. Transferred into a charitable foundation, effective immediately. The lawyers protested. The accountants warned him. The bankers suggested psychological evaluation. Richard listened patiently. Then he said only this. I made a promise, and I intend to keep it. The first family was the hardest. A small apartment on the outskirts of Detroit, peeling paint, second-hand furniture. The widow stared at him as if he were a ghost. You, she said flatly, you're the reason my husband died broke. Richard did not defend himself. He knelt. I stole from him, he said. I stole his future, and I cannot undo that. She spat at his feet. He didn't move. I don't want your blood money, she said. I understand, Richard replied softly. I'm here to tell you the truth, and to stay until you tell me to leave. She slammed the door. He waited in the hallway for 3 hours. Eventually, she opened it again. The second family screamed. The third cursed him in languages he didn't understand. One man struck him across the face. Richard never raised his hands. I deserve that, he said each time. Weeks turned into months. The investigators' list grew longer. 40 families. Some lived in poverty, some in shame. Some had children who had never finished school because they had to work. Richard paid restitution, not just the stolen money, but interest, education funds, medical care, and long-term support. But money was never enough. He sat at kitchen tables and listened. He stood in living rooms and absorbed anger. He wept at graves he had helped dig without ever touching a shovel. Some families forgave him, others never did. Jesus had warned him, and Richard accepted it. The hotels transferred ownership 6 weeks later. Luxury properties that once catered to the wealthy elite were restructured under independent boards. One became a rehabilitation center, another a shelter for displaced families, another a hospice for those who could not afford end-of-life care. Richard did not keep an office. He kept a desk. His salary was modest. His apartment was small. His car was old. But his sleep returned. One evening, as Richard sat alone reviewing documents, he felt it again, that quiet presence. You've lost everything, the voice said gently. Richard shook his head. No, he replied. I've finally stopped pretending to own things that never belonged to me. The miracle had healed his son. But this obedience, this humiliation, this long road of restitution, this was healing him. And for the first time in his life, Richard Al-Mahmoud understood something no balance sheet had ever taught him. Grace is free. But transformation costs everything. 5 years passed. The world moved on. Headlines faded. Stock markets rose and fell. New billionaires replaced old ones. But something quietly irreversible had already taken place. The 9 hotels no longer bore Richard Al-Mahmoud's name as monuments to wealth. They had become something else entirely. The former luxury resort in Las Vegas, once known for champagne fountains and private poker rooms, was now a rehabilitation center. Men and women walked through its doors carrying nothing but addiction, regret, and hope. Some stayed. Some relapsed. Some found their lives again. In New York City, A glass tower that once hosted celebrities now sheltered families with nowhere else to go. Mothers slept without fear for the first time in years. Children ate warm meals at long tables beneath chandeliers that no longer impressed anyone but protected everyone. In Washington, D.C., the most exclusive hotel of the portfolio became a hospice. There were no velvet ropes anymore, no VIP lists, only dignity. People died there every week. But they did not die alone. They died with hands held, pain eased, prayers whispered. And in Miami, the flagship property, Richard's proudest achievement, underwent the most radical transformation of all. It became a pediatric hospital, free. Children whose parents could not afford treatment were flown in from across the country. Doctors volunteered their time. Nurses worked double shifts without complaint. Every room had sunlight. Every hallway had color. Every child had a name, not a number. Richard Al-Mahmoud worked there now, not as an owner, not as a benefactor, as an administrator. He arrived early every morning in a used sedan, carrying a plain coffee cup and a worn leather notebook. He knew the schedules, the supply lists, the budget gaps. He knew which children had passed away and which ones were still fighting. He wrote their names down every night. His life had become smaller and infinitely larger. Adam was 13 now, healthy, curious, quietly compassionate. Every weekend, he volunteered at the hospital, reading to children who were afraid, holding hands when doctors spoke in serious tones. One afternoon, Richard watched his son kneel beside a little girl with no hair and too many tubes. "It's okay to be scared," Adam said softly. "I was scared too." The girl looked at him with wide eyes. "You got better," she said. Adam nodded. "Yes," he replied. "And even when people don't get better, they're still not alone." Richard turned away, overwhelmed. 5 years ago, he had offered 9 hotels in mockery. Now those same buildings were saving lives he would never meet. One evening, as the sun set behind the hospital, Richard stood alone on the rooftop. The city lights flickered on. "You lost everything," a familiar voice said gently. Richard smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I finally found what I was never looking for." The voice was quiet again. And Richard understood something with perfect clarity. The hotels had not been taken from him. They had been returned to their true purpose. And so had he. Years later, when people spoke about the miracle, they often spoke about the coma. They spoke about the scans, the impossible recovery, the doctors who could not explain it. But Richard Al-Mahmoud knew better. The miracle did not begin when his son opened his eyes. It began when he did. Adam grew into a young man with a quiet strength. He never spoke often about what he had seen in the darkness, but when he did, his words carried weight beyond his years. He studied medicine not driven by ambition, but by memory. He remembered the fear, the silence, the hand that held his when he could not hold his father's. And every time he stepped into a hospital room, he carried that memory with him. Richard watched his son walk the halls of the pediatric hospital, no longer as a patient, but as a healer in training. Sometimes Adam would pause beside a child's bed and listen, not to machines, to stories, to fear, to hope. One evening, after a long day, Richard sat alone in his small apartment, leafing through an old notebook. It was filled with names. Children who had lived, children who had not. He prayed for all of them, not because he believed prayer could undo death, but because love does not end where life does. Richard died quietly in his sleep at the age of 67. There was no grand procession, no headlines, but the small chapel overflowed. Families he had once wronged stood beside families he had helped heal. Former addicts, doctors, nurses, children who had survived because a hospital existed where a hotel once stood. Adam spoke at the service. "My father lost an empire," he said, his voice steady, "but he found his soul. He taught me that restitution is possible, that mercy is real, and that no one is beyond redemption." As the service ended, a man in simple white clothing stood quietly at the back. No one noticed when he arrived. No one noticed when he left. But as the final prayer was spoken, a peace settled over the room that no words could explain. Years later, Adam would tell his own children the story, not about wealth, not about hotels, but about a father who learned the truth too late to avoid pain, and just in time to change everything. He would tell them this: the greatest miracle isn't when God heals a body. It's when He heals a heart willing to change. And somewhere beyond what the eye can see, a promise made in mockery had become a covenant fulfilled. 9 hotels were given away, but a soul was found. Let me leave you with one question. If Jesus walked into your life today, not in power, not in glory, but in humility, would you recognize Him? Or would you dismiss Him the way Richard once did? Because the greatest miracle in this story was not a boy waking from a coma. It was a man waking from himself. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect, and then share it with someone who might need it. And if you want more stories of faith, redemption, and the quiet ways heaven still walks among us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Heaven Walks with Us. You're not here by accident.